So I have just concluded 11 years with WWF International here in Switzerland. I managed to find my way to Hong Kong, and I managed to find my way to talk to Star TV, and before I knew it, I was in Star TV in Hong Kong. Then we moved into the ability to do downloadable music, downloadable video, and then it moved into streaming. So I've now moved to Singapore. So MTV was set up in Singapore, so I moved from Hong Kong to Singapore.
Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have Sats with us. He's the former Executive Director of Communications and Marketing of the WWF. It's also our first time to have a charity with us. Of course, we also had UNICEF as a speaker, but on Impact Talks as a podcast, it's a great thing to have WWF with us, and hopefully many more charities to come. Very interesting background as well as very entrepreneurial. So without further ado, I would love for you to take the floor, introduce yourself, what you've done and what you're doing.
I have just concluded 11 years with WWF International here in Switzerland, and I looked after communications and marketing as part of the global senior management team, working with the Director General. So as you or your listeners may know, WWF is an international non-governmental organization. We have about 7,000 people and are spread out across 100 countries. And my role was to be able to drive the marketing and communications agenda in line with the conservation agenda across these 100 offices. So that was what kept me busy over the last 11 years or so, because I came to the WWF from an internet entrepreneurial venture called Soundbuzz, which I had set up in Singapore together with a few partners. And that was in the digital music era, if you will. It was digital music 1.0. And this was the time, the heady days of Napster and MP3 music. And we went through a whole decade, 10 years of watching the industry and helping it to evolve as it went from the humble ringtone to the mighty streaming, catalogs. So that was a real entrepreneurial link that I had to my role at WWF. And prior to that was in television, which sort of seems outdated now, even though TV still has its role, I believe. But in those days, cable television was very new in those parts, 25 years ago. And I had the privilege of working to set up two brilliant brands. One of them was Star Television in Hong Kong, and the other was MTV Asia, based out of Singapore for Southeast Asia and for India. So that's sort of what I would call my non-linear career in three very different industries over 30 years, a decade at a time.
What do you think the parallels were between music or like having a startup within the music industry and then going into a marketing role?
I think that there's one very deep common link, and that's really the audience, and that's really people. And for me, marketing and communications is really about connecting and about creating demand. The idea here is, how do you identify, how do you segment the people that you need to work with or you want to connect to, and how do you talk to them? How do you engage with them? How do you get them to participate with you?
One more question about the time in your advertising agency. Any other stories that you had aha moments?
Well, there were a couple of, most of my time was spent on that basic business that I spoke about. But there were a couple of other interesting ones, which was, I think one of them was related to the onset of the two-wheeler industry, because the two-wheeler industry in India, which was motorcycles and scooters, was a very archaic industry. It was, it was the old version of the Vespa, which had been Indianized, and that the Bajaj was sort of the be-all and end-all of two-wheelers in the Indian two-wheeler market. And this was the onset of the Japanese coming in with Honda, and Honda had this tie-up with the largest two-wheeler in India was the bicycle. So it was Honda coming in to tie in with Hero, which was the largest bicycle manufacturer. I believe they're still the largest bicycle manufacturer on the planet as a single brand. And Hero Honda got together to create this style of motorcycle, which was only a 100cc bike or a 150cc bike, which was tiny compared to things you see on the road everywhere. But that sort of revolutionized the Indian two-wheeler industry. And I was fortunate to be part of that because I was working on that account. And how do you give, how do you introduce a category like this? And how do you actually create the brand differentiation, because others will follow? And others did, but it was quite an eye-opening moment. So it was really at the beginning of that product curve that you were able to, bring about, again, the same math and the same art. That how do you analyze the market and segment it, and how do you create some really fantastic advertising that gets people into like, I must have one. We used to have this concept of pilot markets. So we would take one or two small cities where you would then just launch it in that city and advertise it with that message in that city to see what the take-up was, and then extrapolate those learnings to the other parts of the country and then launch it on a broader basis.
What happens next, and when did you know you had to take the next step?
When Star TV announced that they were looking to launch and they were looking at markets around Asia, including India, I was really interested. I managed to find my way to Hong Kong, and I managed to find my way to talk to Star TV. And before I knew it, I was in Star TV in Hong Kong.
Wow, interesting. Okay, so you're joining MTV. I saw that you joined as vice president right away. Are you living at this point in Hong Kong or in India back?
So I've now moved to Singapore. So I moved. So MTV was set up in Singapore. So I moved from Hong Kong to Singapore.
You have a pretty good job, and most people would be pretty happy with it. Why take the risk? What was going through your mind? How did you eventually decide to take that risk, and why this startup?
I was basically in a non-legacy industry. We were setting new rules on how marketing happened, how sales happened. But the other thing that was happening at this time was the internet. So suddenly this thing called the internet was beginning to bubble. This is 99, right? 98, 99. At that point in time, there were 2 or 3 of us from MTV who said, what if we actually did the next stage of what MTV should be doing, which is on the internet. So I said, well, the logical thing to do is to have the conversation with MTV and say, why don't we, look at this? That conversation was just a bad idea because it went nowhere, and, people were locked into the legacy of being a television business, not being a music-related business.
Really?
I mean, we had projections in terms of how the music industry would eventually have to move online. And by the way, all of that is true. Today in 2020, I can sit here hand on heart and say what we said to people in the year 2000 was absolutely right.
Wow. So what were like the biggest ups and downs going through that journey? Because obviously a lot of self-validation in the beginning, but the market is the market. They're going to hit you. So I can imagine at one point things didn't go as nicely.
So I think a couple of things that just stand out just to sort of move that along. I think the first thing was that music licensing took very long because the labels as legacy businesses were very scared to license digitally, and because it would hurt their physical business. Same old, same problem that you've seen in other industries. The second was on that journey between the initial validation to the final step, there was a huge step in the middle that took place as a part of unforeseen evolution of the market, was the ringtone market. And the ringtone market saved everybody's skin who was in this business, because the music licensing was taking very long. And what a lot of people don't know is that the ringtone licenses are not held by the record companies. The ringtone licenses are held by the publishers. So the publishers are the people who own the copyright to a piece of music. So you can reproduce a ringtone which is in the tune, but not the actual sound recording. Record companies own the actual sound recording, not the underlying copyright. So suddenly, while that was taking time, the publishers stepped in and created this multi-million-dollar ringtone industry. So that was quite an interesting moment. And then we moved into the ability to do downloadable music, downloadable video, and then it moved into streaming. So we exited just before the streaming thing started happening.
Any tips for startups who are at a pivot, especially now with Corona happening? Like, I can imagine pivotal decisions need to be made. Any tips for them?
I think that they are at a distinct advantage because they are not dependent on the physical infrastructure, and the digital infrastructure has survived really well through the COVID crisis, right?
Correct.
So for the digital infrastructure to survive, it means that the core of their business is already on a strong foundation. So it's really now a conviction of their belief in their business model that they need to actually, barrel down along and stay focused. Take a big decision, stay on it, because otherwise, if you start dithering, then you're probably, of course, I'm not saying you don't move if the other things don't move, but if the externalities don't change and you've taken a call, stick the course, stay the course if your team has decided that this is what you want to do.
What is like the main learning lesson you would take away, give to listeners, startups, business owners, investors, whatever, who's listening?
I would ask business owners and business managers to be responsible and ethical in their business operations, because ultimately, while profits are important, it should not come at the cost of other things that they do not price in to their efforts, right? And I think that there is a moral responsibility on business owners to be mindful of the social and environmental impact that they're having. So more than them being neutral, they should be looking to see how can they be positive.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really important aspect. I think the second is that I would tell younger people who are in the earlier stages of their career is that it's really, people don't need to choose one career. I think in today's world, and I'm not even from today's world, I'm going back 30 years, but if I could have a non-linear career, so can they. And I think that you need to identify and extract and build those strengths that are then transferable across. I mean, there's nothing wrong in working in one industry your entire life if that's what you want, but you don't have to feel that that's the only way to do it. And I think that you as an entrepreneur will probably also relate to that. And I think that the third is for the NGO sector. I think that, from like the examples you were giving, I think that the NGO sector needs to find ways to become more entrepreneurial, because there are, what's going to be the next stage of the donor model? Is it going to be impact investing? Is it going to be the social enterprise? And I think that these are examples that again, going back to the same principle, why are they having to be created by boutique shops outside of the sphere? Why are NGOs not experimenting with that? Because there is going to be an evolution, and they need to be able to be part of that evolution. And otherwise you just get left behind. So I think that there's a constant change happening, and there's just so much to learn. I mean, there isn't, one lifetime ain't enough.
Okay, I think that's a great way to stop the episode. I'm super grateful that you came out, and I'm pretty sure that we'll have you on in the future as well, because it was really interesting and everything you've experienced. Thank you for sharing.
Very appreciative, and thank you to all your listeners as well.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group, where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to any business question from the entire Startup Funding Event team.